somewhere in the middle, like the Goldilocks syndrome. She had to try everybody's thing before she finally got to that middle area where she finally found the one that she was like, oh, I'm talking, it might be a monologue this time. Sometimes it is just a monologue, but we just keep it moving, we keep it going because
There are movies that feel less like stories and more like slow, unfolding lessons in how decency tries to breathe inside corrupt systems. And literature-loving friends, The Rainmaker, 1997, was one of those films that quietly educated me long before I realized I was watching a courtroom drama. I remember encountering it on a rainy evening, how fitting that coincidence was, and being instantly drawn to the contrast between youthful hope and institutional rot. A young, broke law graduate wandering through the crumbling alleys of Memphis felt so familiar to the world I knew, the hunger for justice meeting the machinery of greed. The film didn't open with spectacle. It opened with weariness, the kind that sits in your bones when you still believe in fairness, but suspect the rules are written against you. And right from that first frame, the texture of the rain, the cigarette smoke, and the muted yellow lights whisper truth I could almost smell. This wasn't about winning a case. It was about surviving one's own conscience. I think every lover of literature eventually falls in love with underdogs, those who cling to integrity like a torn coat in a storm. Watching Rudy Baylor, the idealistic law graduate at the center of this narrative, I felt that familiar tug of the tragic hero, someone destined to be broken but unwilling to stop trying. The city around him looked tired, morally and physically. There were strip malls, cheap apartments, half-lit offices, and echoes of old Southern grandeur, all hiding the quiet desperation of modern America. It was less a setting and more a metaphor for what happens when the American dream starts rusting from the inside. The rain that kept pouring wasn't just weather. It was guilt history and renewal dripping from the same sky. What struck me most, even before the plot deepened, was the emotional pacing. The director allowed scenes to linger on silences, on eyes hesitating before telling half-truths, on the damn papers in a cheap law office. It reminded me of novels where every object carries moral weight. The flickering lamp, the empty coffee mug, the stack of unpaid bills, each a small footnote to a larger human struggle. I could sense John Grisham's literary roots breathing through the screenplay, that obsession with a small-town idealist confronting the faceless corporation. Yet what elevated this adaptation wasn't only the fidelity to Grisham's narrative. It was a tenderness beneath the cynicism. The film understood that even in a corrupt world, decency can be dramatic. As the story began threading its way through the law firm's corridors and into the dark heart of an insurance case, I kept thinking how often life imitates fiction in the quietest forms. There's a certain helplessness every young professional feels when stepping into an industry ruled by senior predators. Rudy's first jobs, his awkward interactions with manipulative colleagues, and his blind optimism all recall my own early attempts at surviving adult systems. There's always that first moment when you realize competence is not the currency. Connections are. The script captured that humiliation beautifully, making every victory feel fragile, every setback deeply personal. It's why, despite being labeled a courtroom drama, the movie felt closer to a coming-of-age novel. The brief moments of humor tucked between despair carried a surprising warmth. They reminded me of the small jokes we make at funerals, not because we find death funny, but because we must find oxygen somewhere. The dialogue never begged for applause. It whispered truths about people who talk big but live small. And then came the clients, ordinary, poor, bewildered souls whose stories stitched the real moral fabric of the film. When Rudy took on the case of a family denied insurance coverage of their dying son, the tone shifted from personal survival to moral warfare. That was when the narrative transcended its genre. The young lawyer wasn't simply fighting an insurance company. He was confronting the quiet cruelty embedded in bureaucratic language. I could almost hear Dickens muttering approval from the past. What fascinates me, literature-loving friends, is how the film balances sentimentality and realism. Many courtroom tales either drown in melodrama or hide behind cold procedure, but here both coexisted. The fragile hope of the victims and the mechanical indifference of corporate lawyers. The cinematography mirrored this duality. The soft, forgiving glow of human scenes contrasted with the sterile brightness of the courtroom. You could sense the ethical tension in the lighting itself. Even the background extras seemed chosen to reflect America's divided conscience. Clerks typing indifferently while a family's fate was decided by words and contract. It was visual moral philosophy. Then there was the rain again. It punctuated transitions, softened cruelty, and cleansed the screen after acts of quiet corruption. In literature, rain often signals catharsis. In this film, it became an ambient confession. Every drop seemed to carry another injustice washed away unseen. And I, sitting there with tea gone cold, felt the same mixture of anger and admiration that I feel when reading good legal fiction. Anger at the world's indifference, admiration for storytellers who dare to expose it without losing faith in human decency. Looking back now, I realize that what kept me watching wasn't suspense about who would win the case, but curiosity about who would remain good while fighting it. The film's moral architecture was more compelling than its legal one. Each supporting character embodied a choice, compromise or conscience. Some chose comfort, others integrity. And like in Dostoevsky's novels, even the guilty one seemed tired rather than monstrous, which made the tragedy sharper. I've always believed that evil in real life is often just exhausted goodness, and this movie seemed to agree. By the time the first act closed, I found myself emotionally invested not in verdicts but in silences, those pauses before confession, the way a character's eyes would lower after lying, the way the rain muffled applause after a courtroom victory. It reminded me that justice isn't theatrical, it's lonely. The protagonist's sincerity, fragile yet stubborn, became a kind of moral rain washing over everyone around him, forcing even cynics to remember they once believed in right and wrong. The simplicity of its storytelling masked a very complex emotional rhythm. It made me think of how literature often teaches through structure, rising hope, moral test, quiet reckoning. The movie followed that same invisible syllabus. What stayed with me long after the credits wasn't the courtroom speeches, but the texture of Memphis. The way light filtered through blinds onto worn-out desks, the sound of cars passing puddles outside cheap apartments, the exhausted kindness of secretaries and waitresses who understood more than they said. There was poetry in the mundanity, as if Faulkner's ghost had walked into a Grisham story and decided to stay. Each character's face seemed carved from compromise, every smile a negotiation between idealism and survival. And that, perhaps, is the real theme of the film. Not whether justice prevails, but what justice costs the ones who chase it. When I think of it now, I realize the story's greatest power was how it invited us to look inward. It asked gently but insistently whether we too have stopped believing in fairness, whether we too have learned to look away when systems fail the powerless. It's a question literature has asked for centuries, from Hugo to Steinbeck, and here it returned disguised as entertainment. That's why this movie feels timeless. not because of its plot, but because of its conscience. It captured the melancholy of trying to do good in a world that rewards cleverness more than kindness. And somewhere between the rain, the paperwork, and the broken promises, it reminded me that compassion is its own form of rebellion. So when the first act faded into its second, the rain kept falling, I felt the quiet affirmation that great cinema gives. That storytelling can still defend the human spirit better than any lawyer could. And isn't that why we gather here, my literature-loving friends? To witness those rare moments when art cross-examines reality and dares to believe that honesty, even when drenched and shivering, can still stand up in court? The film's first half unfolds like a long, humid afternoon in Memphis where everyone pretends they're not suffocating, and we follow Rudy Baylor as he drifts from student idealism into the real architecture of the American legal jungle. It begins with the kind of quiet defeat that literature so often celebrates, the graduate with dreams too large for the economy that greets him. He isn't the shining young lawyer in a crisp suit. He's a boy with a borrowed tie, a cheap briefcase, and the tremor of someone who's just realized that truth doesn't pay the bills. The small details of his life, the rented room, the bar where he hides from worry, the endless job interviews that collapse into polite rejections, build an atmosphere of slow disillusionment. Yet inside that gloom, there's a spark of naive courage that keeps him moving, and we can sense that spark will soon be tested in ways far crueler than he expects. When he finally finds employment, it's not in some marble-floored firm, but in the morally swampy office of J. Lyman Bruiser Stone, a flashy personal injury lawyer whose smile feels like a lie in motion. The place reeks of hustles disguised as business. Files lie open like wounded promises. Clients wait with hopeless eyes, and everyone, including the secretaries, seems to have mastered the art of pretending. Rudy steps into this office as if entering a Dickensian curiosity shop of law, where legal ethics are just decorative trinkets. The presence of Deck Shiflett, a charismatic but unlicensed paralegal, adds a strange comic rhythm to the decay. Deck knows every loophole and every shortcut, and his worldliness contrasts sharply with Rudy's innocence. Together they form an unlikely duo, one chasing ideals, the other chasing invoices. Watching them, I felt the same mix of fascination and pity I feel when reading about characters who still think integrity can be a business model. The first major narrative thread begins when Rudy encounters the Black family and Buddy Black and their dying son, Donnie Ray. They are poor, exhausted, and humiliated by the relentless refusals of a giant insurance company that has denied coverage for the bone marrow transplant that might have saved their boy. Their kitchen smells of despair, yet they treat Rudy with a politeness that borders on heartbreak. It's in this small living room that the story's moral axis appears, a corporation's indifference measured against a family's faith. The Black's case becomes Rudy's cause, his first real chance to practice not just law but justice. But it also becomes his mirror. Through their helplessness, he begins to see his own powerlessness in a system designed for profit. The screenplay gives this transition a quiet dignity. No melodramatic speeches, just a young man realizing that the world will not reward honesty unless he forces it to. Running parallel is the subplot involving Kelly Riker, a young woman trapped in an abusive marriage to a violent husband. Their meeting in a hospital corridor seems accidental. But in cinematic storytelling, coincidence is often destiny. Kelly's bruises tell the story before her words do. She and Rudy connect through shared fragility. Both are wounded by systems that were supposed to protect them. The tenderness that grows between them never feels like a distraction. It's the film's emotional reprieve, a soft whisper against the shouting of lawsuits and greed. I remember feeling uneasy at first. Two broken people leaning on each other often leads to collapse. But their bond feels less like romance and more like mutual survival. The way the camera lingers on their conversations, the hesitant smiles, the awkward pauses, all reveal how loneliness can be more binding than love. Meanwhile, Rudy's professional life becomes increasingly chaotic. Bruiser Stone's operation crumbles under FBI investigation, and Rudy suddenly finds himself unemployed again. Except this time, he carries a few case files that could either make or destroy him. Among them is the Black's case, a David and Goliath lawsuit against the insurance giant Great Benefit Life. Rudy partners with Deck, and together they open a makeshift law office in a rundown apartment, more dream than enterprise. It reminded me of all those literary scenes where the hero declares independence not out of strength, but necessity, like a young poet publishing pamphlets from a rented room. They hang a crooked sign, drink cheap coffee, and try to look professional for clients who are poorer than they are. Every scene hums with the bittersweet energy of first attempts. The first half builds its tension not through gunfire or chase sequences, but through paperwork, letters ignored, phone calls dodged, documents lost by accident. It's astonishing how suspenseful bureaucracy can be when you realize lives depend on it. Each denial letter from the insurance company lands like a slap, each delay another small death for Donnie Ray. And yet, amidst this procedural despair, the script finds moments of dark humor. Deck celebrates minor victories as if they're revolutions. Rudy rehearses speeches in front of mirrors, tries to sound like someone older and tougher than he feels. The movie treats the law as both absurd and sacred, a contradiction that gives every small triumph a sense of miracle. As Donnie Ray's condition worsens, the film slows its rhythm to a near standstill, forcing us to sit inside the family's helpless waiting. There are no violin swelling, no speeches about courage, just the mechanical sounds of a house waiting for death, the hum of a refrigerator, the soft breathing of a dying boy, the distant thunder of Memphis rain. When he finally passes, the grief feels untheatrical but immense. Rudy doesn't cry. He simply stares at the paperwork that could have saved a life if the world valued compassion over procedure. That scene stays in me because it's not tragedy in the cinematic sense. It's tragedy in the bureaucratic sense, the kind we live every day and rarely notice. Parallel to this grief, the Kelly Riker subplot intensifies. Her husband's violence escalates, and the camera captures it with restraint rather than sensationalism. The bruises, the fear, the quiet apologies all make the audience complicit in the silence that surrounds domestic abuse. Rudy's growing affection for her becomes ethically messy. He's a lawyer, she's a client, but humanity seldom obeys professional codes. When she finally decides to leave her husband, the narrative begins its moral convergence. Rudy is fighting for justice in court, while Kelly is fighting for safety in her own home. Both are confronting bullies in suits, one corporate, one domestic. And both battles require a kind of courage that literature often defines as moral loneliness. By the midpoint, the legal gears begin to turn. Rudy files a lawsuit against Great Benefit, naming their executives and exposing a pattern of bad faith denials. The corporate lawyers, led by the experienced Leo F. Drummond, respond with the full weight of institutional arrogance. The courtroom becomes a metaphorical storm, the rain outside echoing the moral downpour inside. Every pre-trial meeting feels like a fencing match between youthful sincerity and seasoned cynicism. Watching Rudy navigate these waters reminded me of the archetypal hero entering the labyrinth. Except here, the Minotaur wears a tie and carries a briefcase. The beauty of the first half lies in how it transforms paperwork into weaponry. Every motion filed, every objection raised becomes a duel of ethics. The narrative also introduces subtle moments of mentorship. Retired Judge Tyrone Kipler, disillusioned with the system yet still faithful to its ideals, becomes a quiet compass for Rudy. Their conversations reveal the film's philosophical core, that the law, for all its flaws, remains the last fragile institution where truth can occasionally win, if someone still believes in it. Those exchanges reminded me of dialogues between old and young souls in literature, where wisdom is less about knowledge and more about enduring disappointment without bitterness. Kipler's gentle guidance becomes the invisible spine of Rudy's growth, grounding the story in human connection rather than legal spectacle. By the time the first half draws to a close, we stand at a moral cliff. Donnie Ray is dead, but his case has become a symbolic resurrection, a lawsuit that could force a corporation to face its conscience. Kelly is free from her abuser, but not from fear. Deck and Rudy are still broke, but finally purposeful. The storm clouds over Memphis have grown heavier, promising both destruction and cleansing. The film pauses here, at this precipice between despair and defiance, allowing us to breathe before the real trial begins. It's the classic midpoint of transformation where innocence burns away, leaving resolve in its ashes. And as the credits would roll if this were a novel's chapter break, we sense that the rest of the story will no longer be about learning the law. It will be about defining justice. When the trial finally begins, It feels less like a legal proceeding and more like a moral showdown that the whole city of Memphis has been secretly waiting for. The courthouse doesn't glitter with righteousness. It sweats with tension. The wooden benches, the pale lights, the ceiling fans turning lazily above nervous spectators. Everything seems designed to remind us that justice, in reality, is an exhausted institution trying to keep its dignity. Rudy enters this world with the quiet fear of a man who knows he's outnumbered but not necessarily outhearted. His suit looks slightly too large, his briefcase too worn, and yet, as he takes his place before the judge, there's a tremor of purpose that turns inadequacy into authenticity. I remember feeling that this was where literature and cinema finally shook hands, the underdog standing before the gods of bureaucracy, armed only with words and conscience. The early courtroom exchanges are a slow chess game between Rudy and Leo Drummond, the defense attorney whose confidence borders on arrogance. Drummond represents everything Rudy isn't: money, power, lineage, and their verbal duels carry the texture of class warfare disguised as legal argument. Rudy stumbles occasionally, his inexperience exposed before the jury, but each misstep feels human, not foolish. The audience, both inside the film and in front of the screen, begins rooting for him precisely because he bleeds. The film doesn't need grand speeches to make its point. It lets silence and small victories speak louder. When Rudy introduces the first piece of evidence showing the insurance company's deliberate negligence, the camera doesn't cut to triumphant music. It lingers on his face, uncertain but steadfast, as if to remind us that courage often looks like quiet persistence. In between court sessions, the narrative keeps returning to Kelly Riker's story, intertwining personal and professional battles until they feel inseparable. Her abusive husband, Cliff, refuses to vanish from her life, stalking and threatening even after she leaves him. Their scenes carry a dreadful inevitability, like the last pages of tragedy we wish we could rewrite. Kelly's fear is palpable, the trembling hands, the constant glances over her shoulder, and yet there's a new steel forming inside her. Rudy's presence becomes both comfort and danger. He knows that by helping her, he's crossing lines that could destroy his career, but morality rarely survives without a little disobedience. When the confrontation finally comes and Cliff attacks her in their home, the moment erupts with shocking finality. Kelly, in self-defense, kills him. The film handles this not as sensational twist, but as grim release, filmed in dim light and silence, a moral echo of the larger case about systems that push the powerless until they snap. Back in court, Rudy's case grows heavier. The corporate lawyers unleash their arsenal: motions to dismiss, procedural traps, character assassinations. Watching them work is like watching an orchestra of cynicism. Every tactic, every objection is designed to exhaust him. Yet the more they fight, the clearer their cruelty becomes. The film invites us to feel the absurdity of a system where truth has to argue for its right to exist. Rudy's mentor, Judge Kipler, presides with weary integrity, occasionally throwing defense a glare that says he's seen this dance before. His restraint gives weight to every small moment of justice: a sustained objection, a witness allowed to speak, a truth that survives cross-examination. These fragments of fairness feel like lanterns flickering in a long tunnel. The turning point arrives when Rudy calls a great benefit employee who accidentally leaked the incriminating memo, the one that coldly instructs staff to deny all expensive claims until policyholders give up or die. It's the heart of the film's indictment, the smoking gun that reveals corporate cruelty as policy, not error. As the witness reads a memo aloud, the courtroom falls silent, except for the rain outside tapping like a metronome of guilt. There's no need for music. The horror sits in the bureaucratic language itself. I felt my chest tighten the way it does when reading a letter in Kafka, that sense of faceless authority crushing individual lives through paperwork. In that moment, Rudy isn't just a lawyer. He's every idealist who ever dared to believe decency could win inside a rigged system. From there, the case becomes less about law and more about morality stamina. The defense team, sensing the tide turning, tries to settle quietly, offering money that could secure Rudy's future. It's the devil's classic bargain, and literature-loving friends, you can almost see the temptation flicker in his eyes. He's broke, exhausted, and still grieving the black family's loss. But he refuses, insisting that what's at stake isn't a payout, it's accountability. That refusal marks his real graduation from student to advocate. The jury's verdict, when it comes, Feels like a long exhale of human decency. They find great benefit guilty and award massive punitive damages. The black's eyes fill with tears not of joy but of disbelief, as though they never expected justice to actually arrive. The courtroom bursts into applause muted by the weight of what's been lost. Donnie Ray is gone and no verdict can resurrect him. The victory tastes bittersweet, and that honesty is what gives the film its lasting power. Yet even triumph, the movie reminds us, is temporary. Great benefit declares bankruptcy immediately after the verdict, dissolving responsibility into legal smoke. It's one of those endings that literature handles best. Victory turned hollow by realism. The system protects itself. The oppressor retreats behind paperwork once again. Rudy's expression in that final hearing isn't anger. It's the numb clarity of someone who has seen how truth can win in theory and still lose in practice. The blacks thank him anyway, their gratitude tinged with resignation. It's the kind of ending that stays in your throat because it mirrors life's own compromises. Justice achieved too late, compassion mistaken for naivety, hope forced to reinvent itself. Parallel to this, Kelly's storyline resolves quietly. After the incident with her husband, she faces potential trial herself, but Rudy, now tempered by experience, handles the aftermath with wisdom instead of panic. Their final scenes together aren't declarations of love. They're confessions of weariness. Two people who have survived their private wars find a fragile peace in each other's company. The Memphis rain falls one last time, soft and cleansing, and the camera lingers on their silhouettes walking away from everything they've endured. It isn't a fairy tale conclusion. It's a reprieve, a pause between storms. I remember feeling that this was the truest kind of cinematic closure, not perfection, just possibility. In its second half, the film transforms from narrative to meditation. The courtroom becomes a metaphor for existence itself. Every argument a moral choice, every witness a memory, every verdict a temporary illusion of order. The movie seems to ask, again and again, what it means to fight for justice when the victory can be undone by paperwork the next day. And perhaps the answer lies in Rudy's final decision to leave the profession altogether. In the last scenes, he walks away from the law, from the noise of lawsuits, and from the city's false promises. His departure isn't defeat. It's an act of preservation. He refuses to become another cynic in a gray suit. Watching him leave, I thought of literary wanderers like Holden Caulfield or Pip. Characters who outgrow their worlds and walk away before corruption feels normal. The rain keeps falling, but this time it sounds gentler, almost forgiving. What lingers after credits is not outrage, but a deep melancholy, the kind that makes you reflect on your own complicity. We've all been Rudy at some point, idealists negotiating with disappointment. And we've all been the jury, applauding temporary justice while knowing how fragile it is. The Rainmaker's second half holds up a mirror to adulthood itself. The slow acceptance that good people sometimes lose, that systems rarely heal, and that integrity, though unprofitable, is the only wealth worth keeping. It's not a happy ending, but it's an honest one, and that honesty is rarer than any victory. As the screen fades to black, the rain becomes memory, steady, persistent, purifying. And I'm left with that quiet, enduring thought that perhaps storytelling itself is our last courtroom, the place where we can still cross-examine power and remind ourselves that compassion, though often bankrupt, never really closes its doors. What makes this story endure long after the courtroom doors are closed isn't merely its plot or verdict, but the human faces carrying it. Tired, hopeful, deceitful, broken, idealistic faces that turn legal battles into emotional epics. Every character breathes the weary air of a world where morality feels out of fashion, and yet each clings to fragments of decency, like someone holding on to pieces of a sinking ship. When I think of the story's characters, I don't see them as archetypes from a legal drama. I see them as moral test cases, each revealing what happens when integrity meets exhaustion. At the heart stands Rudy Baylor, a young man whose journey is both professional and spiritual. He begins as a law school graduate who still believes that right and wrong exist as categories rather than negotiations. What makes him compelling isn't his brilliance or eloquence. It's his vulnerability. His naivety never feels foolish. It feels precious, like an endangered instinct. In his eyes, you see the last light of idealism flickering against the machinery of capitalism. Literature has always loved these figures, the honest man wandering through dishonest institutions. I think of him as a cousin of Dickens's Pip, or perhaps a distant descendant of Camus' Moussault, but purified by empathy. Every scene with him radiates quiet endurance. He doesn't shout his beliefs. He carries them like a burden. He grows not by learning clever arguments, but by realizing that the truth alone rarely wins unless it is fought for with courage. What deepens Rudy's character is his relationship with fear. He's afraid most of the time, afraid of failing his clients, of disappointing himself, of becoming like the people he despises. Yet he doesn't let fear dictate him. He learns to negotiate with it. The courage here isn't loud or cinematic. It's the kind you practice in silence when you decide to show up again tomorrow despite humiliation. His growth through the film is invisible but profound. By the end, he doesn't triumph because he wins a case. He triumphs because he refuses to surrender his humanity. And when he walks away from the legal profession, it isn't defeat. It's a moral exhale, a man saving his conscience from turning into another business expense. Standing beside him, and often saving him from himself, is Deck Shiflett, one of those beautifully ambiguous characters who seem to exist in the gray zones literature adores. Deck is older, unlicensed, endlessly scheming, yet surprisingly loyal. His cynicism is both armor and wound. He laughs at everything, especially idealism, but beneath the sarcasm, you can sense an affection for Rudy's sincerity. Their friendship works because it's built on contrast. One sees a world as hopelessly corrupt, the other as reparable. Together they embody the two halves of moral adulthood, innocence and adaptation. Deck's role in the story reminds me that even flawed people can be faithful allies. He's the streetwise pragmatist who knows that truth alone doesn't pay rent, and his half-mocking humor keeps the film grounded. There's a melancholy wisdom in him, too, a sense that he once shared Rudy's optimism before life stripped it away. I often think of Deck as a warning. This is what Rudy might become if hope ever leaves him. Then there's Kelly Riker, whose story carries a different kind of violence. The private, invisible kind that occurs behind closed doors. Her character is written with restraint, avoiding the melodrama often attached to victims of abuse. She doesn't cry for sympathy. She simply exists in quiet survival mode, her every gesture calculated to avoid provoking her husband. The brilliance of her portrayal lies in the small things, how she flinches at loud voices, how her smile feels rehearsed, how she talks about love as if it's a condition rather than a feeling. When she and Rudy connect, it isn't romance in conventional sense. It's two wounded souls recognizing each other's fractures. She doesn't need rescuing. She needs witness. That difference is what gives her dignity. And when she finally defends herself with deadly force, the film refuses to judge her. It presents her act not as rebellion, but as inevitability, a moral explosion born from years of silence. She becomes a symbol of the quiet rebellions that rarely make headlines but change destinies. Opposite Rudy's fragile integrity stands Leo F. Drummond, the corporate attorney who could have walked out of modern-day Inferno as a middle management demon. He isn't evil in the theatrical sense. He's worse, reasonable, polite, professional. He represents the bureaucratic face of moral decay, the kind of man who quotes regulations while destroying lives. His calmness in court, his tailored suits, his faint smile when crushing opponents, all betrays how injustice survives through manners. Drummond doesn't hate Rudy. He pities him. That pity is chilling because it's how corruption looks when it stops pretending to be ashamed. In literary terms, he's the embodiment of the system itself. Articulate, educated, utterly soulless. And yet, watching him, I couldn't bring myself to despise him entirely. There's a sadness behind his superiority, the sadness of someone who has long forgotten what conviction feels like. He's what happens when talent outpaces conscience. The supporting characters, too, enrich the film's tapestry. Out in Buddy Black, parent of the dying boy, are written with heartbreaking authenticity. They're not heroic, not eloquent, just ordinary people clinging to fairness as if it were oxygen. Their politeness toward Rudy, even in despair, says more about American dignity than any speech could. When their son dies, their gratitude to Rudy remains undiminished. It's one of the purest gestures in the film. Thanking a man who couldn't save them but tried. They personify the moral center that everyone else orbits. Their faith, even after betrayal, feels biblical. Job rewritten in Memphis dialect. J. Lyman Bruiser Stone, Rudy's first employer, occupies the comic tragic slot of the hypocritical mentor. He's flashy, corrupt, and strangely charming, the kind of man you hate to admire. He introduces Rudy to the underbelly of the legal world, and through him, we see how cynicism disguises itself as success. Bruiser is the film's living parable. Corruption that's comfortable in its own skin. His eventual downfall under FBI scrutiny doesn't cleanse him. It merely relocates him. He's a ghost of what Rudy might become if conscience ever starts to feel optional. I sometimes think of him as the novelistic fallen father, the one who teaches through failure. And then there's Judge Kipler, the moral elder in this ensemble, a retired professor turned judge. He radiates quiet decency. His presence reminds us that systems don't fail because every individual within them is evil. They fail because too few individuals like him remain. He doesn't grandstand. He guides. He becomes a silent conscience for Rudy, offering perspective instead of solutions. In every classic narrative, there's a moment when a younger protagonist looks to an older figure and sees not authority, but example. Kipler fills that role beautifully. His calm faith in procedure, even when it's flawed, prevents the story from sliding into nihilism. He reminds Rudy and us that the law, for all its ugliness, is still the last refuge where truth can occasionally survive. Even the minor characters matter. The insurance company's executives, the cold secretaries, the smirking young associates. All these brief portraits sketch the anatomy of indifference. They aren't monsters. They're bureaucrats. That's what makes them frightening. They represent how evil often functions in the modern world. Efficiently, quietly, within office hours. Their detachment mirrors what Hannah Arendt once called the banality of evil, how wrongdoing no longer requires hatred, only procedure. Watching them stamp, sign, and file away human suffering, I felt that peculiar chill of recognition. We've all met such people. Some days we are them. Together, these characters form not just a cast, but a moral ecosystem. Each one defines justice differently. For Rudy, it's empathy. For Drummond, it's procedure. For Deck, it's survival. For Kelly, it's safety. For the blacks, it's acknowledgement. And for Kipler, it's endurance. That diversity of definitions is what gives the film its human weight. It doesn't preach, it presents. It lets us decide which version of justice we still believe in. That, I think, is the truest kind of storytelling. When characters argue philosophy through their lives instead of their words. What fascinates me most is how these figures evolve in subtle, almost literary ways. None of them change dramatically. They simply reveal more of what they already were. Rudy's decency deepens. Drummond's emptiness expands. Kelly's fragility hardens into strength. Their arcs are not transformations but unveilings, as if the film were peeling away layers of civility to expose the core of each soul. By the end, everyone has been judged, not by the court, but by the rain itself, that constant symbol of washing, eroding, and renewing. Some are cleansed, others exposed. It's poetic justice delivered through weather. When the story concludes and we look back on these lives, what stays isn't the verdict but the faces. The way Rudy's expression shifts from hope to wisdom. Kelly's eyes regain a trace of calm, and Drummond's smile finally looks tired. They are not winners or losers. They are survivors of conscience. And perhaps that's the quiet miracle of this narrative. It refuses to glorify heroism or villainy. It portrays goodness not as triumph but as endurance. In a cinematic landscape often obsessed with power, these characters remind us that gentleness, though fragile, is still revolutionary. And so, my literature-loving friends, when the final rain falls on Memphis and the credits roll, I don't remember legal jargon or verdicts. I remember people, each a reflection of the moral choices we make when no one is watching. That is what makes these characters unforgettable. They don't exist to entertain us. They exist to remind us who we are when the storm begins. Every time I return to this film, I find myself uncovering the kind of small, almost secret details that make cinema feel alive, the strange coincidences, behind-the-scenes truths, and artistic accidents that turn a good story into a kind of myth. These aren't the facts you'd find in trivia column. They're the ones that whisper about fate, process, and irony, those odd harmonies between real life and fiction that make me believe stories sometimes write themselves through us. And this particular film is full of such quiet curiosities that reveal just how intricately reality and art were braided together in its making. The first and most haunting fact is that this film marked a peculiar crossroads in Francis Ford Coppola's career, the same Coppola who gave us the operatic crime sagas and dreamy nightmares of The Godfather and Apocalypse Now. By the time he took on this project, he was struggling financially, weighed down by years of creative risk-taking that hadn't always paid off. It's strange to imagine a director of such magnitude fighting his own battles with the same weary idealism as his protagonist. In many ways, he was Rudy Baylor at this stage of his life. Bruised by the system, still holding on to belief that truth and artistry could coexist. He chose to adapt John Grisham's novel not as a cynical commercial move, but as an experiment in sincerity. The result is a legal drama that feels deeply human, almost humble, an auteur known for operas of power turning instead toward a story about decency. The irony here is almost poetic. A titan of cinema making one of his most grounded films precisely when his own empire was crumbling. There's something quietly fascinating about how the casting came together, too. Matt Damon, who plays Rudy, was not yet the household name he would become after Good Will Hunting, a film released just weeks later. When Coppola chose him, it was considered a gamble. Damon wasn't the obvious choice for a courtroom hero. He looked too young, too clean, too boyish to stand against corporate wolves. But that was exactly what Coppola wanted. An actor whose sincerity could pierce cynicism. The strange part is how life imitated art once again. Damon himself, a Harvard graduate struggling for recognition in Hollywood, was living a parallel journey of being underestimated. When he walks into those courtroom scenes, you can almost feel the rawness of someone who hasn't yet learned to fake confidence. It's not performance. It's authenticity captured before fame could polish it away. The camera seems to know it's recording a man just before the world discovers him. Then there's a strange web of connections among the cast that reads almost like fate. Danny DeVito, who plays Dex Shiflett, was also a producer on the film. His dual role, both in front of and behind the camera, mirrors his character's blend of pragmatism and guidance. DeVito had long admired Coppola, and their partnership here carries an energy that feels more fraternal than professional. On set, he reportedly acted as the crew's morale keeper, cracking jokes during tense days of filming. That spirit of resilience seeps into his character's warmth. Dex's humor doesn't feel written. It feels lived. And the dynamic between DeVito and Damon off-screen reflected exactly what we see on screen. A veteran teaching a newcomer how to survive without losing heart. Another little-known detail is that Coppola personally rewrote large sections of the script himself, despite being credited only as screenwriter. He approached Grisham's original novel with the instinct of a poet rather than a legal technician. He stripped away subplots, compressed dialogue, and focused instead on atmosphere and humanity. The strangest part is how he described the process. He said he treated the courtroom like a confessional booth. That explains the film's tone. Instead of focusing on legal cleverness, he built emotional silence around moral testimony. It's why the movie often feels less like a thriller and more like a quiet meditation on ethics disguised as drama. One of my favorite strange facts concerns the film's cinematography. The lighting throughout is intentionally diffused to create a near-constant overcast mood, even during indoor scenes. Coppola instructed cinematographer John Toll to make it always feel like it's about to rain. What's eerie is that during most of the Memphis shoot, the city actually did rain, relentlessly, as if nature were in on the metaphor. Locals at the time joked that God was helping Coppola with continuity. You can almost sense that dampness in every frame, not artificial, but atmospheric truth. It's one of those rare coincidences where the environment itself collaborates with storytelling, blurring the boundary between production design and providence. And then there's the casting of Kelly Reichardt, played by Claire Danes, another moment of serendipity. She was only 18 at the time, stepping straight from the emotional storms of Romeo and Juliet into this quieter but deeper role. Coppola initially hesitated, worrying she might appear too young to carry such a bruised history, but when she read her first scene, the one in the hospital corridor, he reportedly whispered, "That's her." The strange beauty of her performance is that she never seems to act. She just exists, Her trembling voice, her hesitant gaze, her exhausted kindness. All of it feels so unstudied that many viewers forget how young she actually was. Danes later said in an interview that she used her own experiences of anxiety and vulnerability to shape Kelly's quiet defiance. It explains why her scenes with Damon feel almost documentary. Two actors not pretending to be adults yet, trying to figure out how empathy works. One can't talk about the film's oddities without mentioning the real-life legal influences behind it. Grisham, before becoming a best-selling author, was himself a practicing lawyer in Mississippi, and the Great Benefit Insurance case was reportedly inspired by dozens of genuine lawsuits against corporate insurers in the 1980s and early 1990s. The strangest twist is that after the film's release, several real families wrote to Grisham and Coppola, claiming that their experiences mirror the Black story almost word for word. Some even sent copies of their denial letters to show that the movie wasn't exaggerating. It blurred fiction, in fact so perfectly that the line almost vanished. When art imitates life so closely that the victims of reality recognize themselves in fiction, storytelling becomes activism. The production itself had peculiar energy. Coppola, known for his volatile sets, insisted on directing this one with unusual calm. Crew members described the atmosphere as oddly peaceful. It was as if the chaos of his previous films had exhausted him into serenity. Yet beneath that quiet, strange accidents kept occurring. One of the courthouse sets was accidentally flooded after a storm, and instead of halting production, Coppola filmed the water reflections and integrated them into transition shots. The rain again refused to stay metaphorical. It kept insisting on being part of the story. These small improvisations gave the film its organic texture, making every visual feel spontaneous and real. Another strange footnote is how the film's score, composed by Elmer Bernstein, functions almost invisibly. Bernstein, who had written for epics and westerns, approached this project with minimalist philosophy. The music should feel like a conscience, not a soundtrack. Most scenes are underscored by faint piano notes or distant strings, barely audible but emotionally surgical. When Rudy delivers his closing argument, the music swells not in triumph but in quiet mourning. Bernstein reportedly said he was inspired by Gregorian chants and Southern church hymns, spiritual sounds stripped of dogma, designed to evoke moral clarity rather than sentimentality. It's fascinating that a composer best known for bombastic themes would deliver one of his most restrained works here, as if the film's humility infected even its soundscape. Even the editing carries its own strangeness. Coppola cut the film himself, working without studio interference, a rarity in the late 90s. He edited it in his Napa Valley estate, far from Hollywood, using what he described as a monastic routine, waking at dawn, reviewing footage in silence, and treating the process as penance. The result is an editing rhythm that feels unusually humane. Scenes breathe, pauses linger. You can feel the editor's compassion for the characters, not just technical precision. There's something sacred about an artist known for grandeur choosing restraint as his late career language. It feels less like a movie assembled and more like a story confessed. And here's a piece of cinematic irony that still amazes me. Despite its artistry, the film was released in the same year as blockbusters like Titanic and Men in Black, and thus slipped under the radar. It wasn't a failure, but it wasn't celebrated either, which in hindsight feels symbolically perfect. Just as Rudy's victory is undercut by the system's indifference, the film's brilliance was overshadowed by spectacle. It's as though fate decided to make the film's reception echo its theme, decency unnoticed in a noisy world. Over time, though, critics began revisiting it, calling it Coppola's quiet masterpiece. That delayed recognition is another strange alignment, a story about justice that had to wait for its own justice. Even the title holds odd poetry. Rainmaker is an old American term for someone who brings prosperity, a salesman, a deal maker, sometimes even a con artist. In the movie, it becomes ironic. The supposed rainmaker isn't the corporate lawyer who wins fortunes. It's the young man who brings moral rain to cleanse corruption. Yet there's another layer to it. Coppola, returning after financial drought, was himself hoping to be a rainmaker, not just in money but in redemption. The title, in a quiet meta way, describes both the protagonist and the artist who created him. Life imitating title, title reflecting maker. What I love most about these strange facts is how seamlessly they merge with the film's soul. Each one feels less like trivia and more like evidence that the story wanted to exist. The constant real rain, the inexperienced cast who mirror their characters, the director seeking salvation through a tale of moral endurance, all of it converges into something mystical. Sometimes cinema behaves like destiny in motion. This was one of those times. And the strangest truth of all, literature-loving friends, is that the film's power lies not in how extraordinary its making was, but in how ordinary its truths turned out to be. Everyone involved was, in some way, trying to make something honest in a dishonest world. That, perhaps, is the ultimate oddity, that a legal drama about modest heroism could become one of Coppola's most personal confessions. Behind every strange fact hides a small grace, a reminder that even in an industry of illusion, sincerity occasionally slips through. And just like the rain that kept falling uninvited onto Memphis sets, the story kept insisting on cleansing everything it touched, quietly, insistently, beautifully. It's always fascinating to watch how critics, academics, and audiences wrestle with film that looks simple but contains deep philosophical sediment beneath its quiet surface. Over the years, this story has invited not just reviews but essays, classroom debates, and late-night confessions from lawyers and ordinary viewers alike. Its courtroom is less about verdicts and about faith. Faith in fairness, faith in institutions, and faith in ourselves when those institutions collapse. Every critical perspective I've encountered seems to orbit one essential question. Is this film cynical about justice or deeply romantic about it? The answer, depending on who you ask, keeps shifting like light through rain. When it first reached theaters, many reviewers saw it as a return to moral storytelling after a decade of bombast. Some praised it for stripping away the flashy gloss of earlier legal thrillers. Others accused it of being too quiet, too introspective for mainstream taste. What most agreed on, though, was that it marked a peculiar emotional maturity for Francis Ford Coppola, a director once known for operatic scale, now turning inward toward ethical intimacy. One critic from a New Yorker called it a film about decency in slow motion, while the Chicago Tribune described it as a rare courtroom movie that actually believes in human beings. I think that's the heart of its critical endurance. It refuses to treat morality as spectacle. Instead, it lingers on faces, pauses, and paperwork, daring us to find drama in decency. In later years, scholars of American film began connecting it to a long literary tradition stretching back to To Kill a Mockingbird and even The Grapes of Wrath. They noted how it resurrected the archetype of the moral outsider, the individual who operates within the system but never truly belongs to it. Rudy Baylor became, in their readings, a post-Reagan echo of Atticus Finch, idealism reborn in a decade defined by corporate cynicism. What makes this comparison striking is how the film subverts the heroic template. Atticus was seasoned and dignified. Rudy is awkward and uncertain. Yet both serve as vessels for the same cultural longing, that the law might still contain a heartbeat. Some professors even teach the film alongside Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man to discuss how invisibility functions as both curse and power in modern institutions. Rudy's anonymity, his smallness, becomes his ethical advantage. The giant corporations don't see him coming precisely because they've stopped noticing small people altogether. Other critical voices approached it from a socio-political angle. They saw it as a subtle indictment of late 20th century America, a time when faith in institutions had begun to erode. The mid-90s were filled with corporate scandals, privatized healthcare debates, and the lingering disillusionment of post-Watergate generations. The film, without preaching, dramatized that national fatigue. Its villains aren't monstrous individuals. They're polite executives and silent systems. That portrayal resonated with critics who were weary of caricatures. One scholar wrote that the real antagonist isn't the insurance company, but the language of contract itself, how modern societies weaponize paperwork to erase compassion. I remember reading that line and nodding. It felt exactly right. The film's genius lies in turning bureaucracy into tragedy. Among legal professionals, reactions were oddly personal. Some attorneys admired the realism, the endless depositions, the procedural drudgery, the quiet grind of injustice. Others laughed at its idealism, insisting that no real rookie lawyer could face such a giant alone. But even those skeptics admitted that the film captured something emotionally true, the loneliness of standing up to power. Bar Association screened it during ethics seminars, using it as a case study in professional conscience. There's something poetic about that fiction serving as moral education for those living its reality. One retired judge reportedly told Coppola that he wished more lawyers would watch the movie before taking the oath. It reminded them, he said, that empathy isn't extracurricular. It's part of the job. Feminist critics approached the story through Kelly Reicher's lens, rereading it as an allegory of patriarchal violence. For them, the courtroom wasn't just a site of legal struggle, but of gendered symbolism. Kelly's husband represented domestic oppression. The corporation represented systemic oppression. And Rudy's effort to defend both Kelly and the black family became an act of masculine allyship learning humility. Some argue that the film's treatment of Kelly still leaned towards savior narratives. Others countered that her final act, defending herself, restored agency that earlier scenes denied. What I find moving is that both interpretations coexist peacefully within the same text. The film neither glamorizes nor condemns her. It simply witnesses her. And that's what feminist storytelling often demands, not judgment, but visibility. Religious and philosophical readings added another layer. The constant rain, the moral cleansing, the recurrent imagery of water and baptism, all of it invited theological interpretation. Some essayists viewed the film as a modern morality play about redemption through compassion. The rain, they argued, functions as divine witness, falling impartially on the righteous and corrupt alike. I remember one particularly beautiful phrase from a review. Every drop in this movie is a question from heaven. Who among you will stay clean? That notion of divine observation ties a narrative to spiritual literature, turning the courtroom into a kind of purgatory where souls, not cases, are judged. Rudy's final decision to abandon law feels almost monastic, a withdrawal from worldly corruption to preserve faith. It's not hard to imagine Dostoevsky smiling at such an ending. From a cinematic perspective, film theorists found themselves intrigued by Coppola's stylistic restraint. They saw in it a quiet rebellion against Hollywood's addiction to spectacle. His use of long takes, muted colors, and slow fades suggested a filmmaker deconstructing his own legacy. Critics who once accused him of excess now praise his minimalism. They called it the anti-Godfather aesthetic. No grand orchestras, no lavish sets, just moral weather. Some even compare his approach to European neorealism, noting how the film's textures evoke post-war Italian dramas, where humanity survives amid decay. In those comparisons, I see an important shift. The movie ceased to be just a genre piece and became part of a larger artistic conversation about sincerity in cinema. The reception among audiences was gentler, but equally complex. Viewers who expected a standard courtroom thriller were surprised by its melancholy tone. Yet, that very quietness earned it a cult following over time. Law students began quoting its lines in graduation speeches. Social justice groups screened it at fundraisers. It became, slowly, a comfort film for those who still believed ethics had cinematic power. What's fascinating is that while critics debated its ideology, ordinary viewers embraced its empathy. For them, it wasn't about systems or symbolism. It was about the look on Rudy's face when he realizes that goodness might never be rewarded but must still be practiced. That expression spoke more truth than any verdict. Over the decades, new critical movements kept rediscovering the film. Environmental critics pointed to the rain motif as metaphor for natural cleansing in a polluted moral climate. Postmodernists admired how it blurred genre boundaries. Part legal thriller, part romance, part parable. Even economic theorists weighed in, calling it a soft Marxist fable about labor versus capital. Each reading, though wildly different, circled the same gravitational center: compassion confronting indifference. I think that's why it continues to attract analysis. It's morally transparent but intellectually porous, allowing everyone to find their own reflection within it. Then there were the strange coincidences in its real-world afterlife. Around the early 2000s, several law schools began offering elective courses titled The Rainmaker and the Ethics of Representation, where students discussed the balance between empathy and procedure. Coppola himself once attended one of those classes unannounced, sitting quietly in the back before sharing stories of how he, too, had lost faith in systems larger than himself. Imagine that. The director of The Godfather humbly discussing ethics with students half his age, all because a small courtroom film still carried moral weight. It's almost literary symmetry. The teacher becoming the student again. Critics today tend to see the film as prophetic. In an age of corporate domination and algorithmic indifference, its depiction of faceless injustice feels alarmingly current. Some have called it a movie that aged into relevance. Others note that its empathy for working-class America prefigured later populist narratives, though without the cynicism those movements often carried. What keeps it timeless is its refusal to despair. Even as institutions fail, the story insists that individuals can still matter. That insistence, I think, is what literature and cinema share at their best. The faith that one person's honesty can momentarily interrupt history's corruption. Perhaps the most poignant critical reflection comes not from academics, but from viewers who saw in Rudy Baylor a version of themselves. Letters sent to Coppola decades later often began the same way. I once thought I could fix the system. These correspondences blur the line between review and confession. They reveal how deeply the movie resonated with people who once believed in fairness and later learned its cost. Some thank the film for reminding them that even disillusionment can be dignified if it comes from caring too much. Others simply said they felt less alone watching it. That, to me, is the ultimate critical success, when analysis becomes empathy. Looking back through all these interpretations, I realize that no single perspective owns a film. It lives at the intersection of all of them: the legal, the spiritual, the political, the artistic, the personal. It's a story about one man's fight that somehow becomes everyone's quiet autobiography. Each viewing feels like standing in rain again. You can't stay untouched. You absorb something. And perhaps that's why critics, decades later, still write about it as though discovering it for the first time. It's not because the plot changed, but because we did. Every generation sees its own reflection in that wet Memphis courtroom. And so, my literature-loving friends, as the rain keeps falling across those old reels of film and scholars keep arguing in classrooms, the movie remains what it always was. Not a verdict, but a question. Can decency still win in a world that doesn't reward it? Every critic answers differently, yet all agree on one thing. The question refuses to die. Maybe that persistence is the film's truest miracle. The making of this film has always felt to me like a paradox in motion, a grandmaster of cinema deciding, after decades of epic storytelling, to craft something small, intimate, and humble, and discovering in that restraint a strange, new kind of freedom. To understand production is to glimpse an artist quietly reinventing himself. Francis Ford Coppola had spent years building worlds filled with thunder and spectacle, but by the mid-1990s, he was financially bruised and spiritually tired. The very industry he helped define had turned corporate. Budgets ballooned. Studios demanded market formulas, and personal visionaries were treated like liabilities. Against that backdrop, it's fascinating that he chose to adapt a John Grisham legal novel, a genre piece, a bestseller, something the Hollywood system understood. Yet Coppola's intention was the opposite of commercial. He wanted to strip filmmaking down to moral oxygen. He said later that he made the picture as a craftsman returned to workshop, meaning without entourage or empire, just a bare act of telling truth through image. The production began in Memphis, Tennessee, the original setting of Grisham's story. Coppola refused to relocate to sound stages in Los Angeles, insisting that authenticity could only come from the damp air, the southern accents, and the worn brick textures of real streets. The choice proved prophetic. Memphis, with its slow humidity and musical melancholy, shaped the film's rhythm far more than any script note. Locals remember the crew as modest and almost invisible. No loud caravans, no ego. Coppola often directed in a raincoat, strolling with a small handheld monitor, greeting shopkeepers, asking residents about weather patterns. He wanted the city to perform itself, not to be dressed up. Even the extras were mostly real citizens. The courtroom scenes, for instance, used actual county clerks and stenographers instead of trained actors. He believed their gestures would carry truth without instruction. That decision, while risky, gave the film an unforced realism, an atmosphere that feels lived in rather than designed. The casting process reveals just as much about the director's intuition. Matt Damon, at the time barely known, had auditioned for several bigger roles in Hollywood and been politely dismissed. Coppola saw in him what others called too gentle. That gentleness became the axis of the film. Damon later said he was terrified through most of the shoot, but Coppola used that anxiety deliberately, often whispering instructions seconds before action, so that Damon's hesitation on camera was genuine. It's fascinating how manipulation can serve honesty. By keeping young actors slightly off balance, Coppola captured exactly the vulnerability Rudy Baylor needed. Danny DeVito, conversely, brought seasoned ease. On set, he was a fountain of warmth, calling the film a vacation for the soul because there were no explosions, just people talking. He bonded with Damon over long dinners where they discussed not stardom but survival, how to keep empathy alive in a competitive industry. Those dinners became informal rehearsals. Coppola encouraged him to improvise lines that later slipped into the final cut. Claire Danes' involvement was equally serendipitous. She had just completed Romeo and Juliet and was still navigating the transition from teenager to adult roles. Coppola, worried that Hollywood might harden her too fast, treated her scenes as protective spaces. He kept sets quiet when she acted, banning unnecessary crew from the room, so her performance could remain fragile. That approach gave her portrayal of Kelly Riker its trembling authenticity. She once described Coppola's direction as like being guided through fog by someone who already drowned there. It's such a haunting phrase, and it encapsulates how the director transmitted emotion not through technical notes, but through atmosphere. From a technical standpoint, the film's production design was intentionally understated. Production designer Howard Cummings spent weeks photographing decaying law offices, peeling wallpaper, and dated signage across Memphis. Coppola told him, "Nothing must look new. This story happens where things are used up." Even the props carried history. Desks were borrowed from abandoned courthouses, telephones from thrift shops, and Rudy's battered briefcase from a real attorney who had carried it for 20 years. Cummings remembered rubbing dust into the leather each morning before takes to maintain continuity of fatigue. The effect is invisible but powerful. Every object seems to sigh. The cinematography, handled by John Toll, became a symphony of gray light. Toll, who had just shot Legends of the Fall, was accustomed to sweeping landscapes, yet here he turned his lens inward. He and Coppola agreed that the camera should feel empathetic rather than judgmental. They decided on subtle handheld movements, almost imperceptible, to mimic the uncertainty of moral footing. The palette, muted blues, browns, and pale yellows, was chosen after Coppola noticed how Memphis rain turned asphalt into mirror. He wanted the city to appear constantly reflective, as if every surface questioned what it saw. To achieve that, Toll diffused light through thin silk even on sunny days, creating perpetual overcast. Ironically, nature helped. Storms rolled through week after week, forcing the crew to delay, but also gifting them real wet streets. The rain, accidental yet thematic, became a free special effect that cost patience instead of money. One of the production's most revealing choices was the editing method. Rather than delivering dailies to a distant post-production house, Coppola built a temporary editing suite inside his hotel. Each night, he reviewed footage with a small team, sometimes recutting entire scenes before sunrise. That rhythm blurred shooting and editing into a single process. Crew members said he treated filmmaking like jazz: watch, respond, revise, repeat. When producers visited to check progress, they were astonished to find nearly finished sequences assembled mid-shoot. Coppola smiled and said, "I don't direct, I compose." That fluidity explains the film's organic pacing. Scenes flow into one another like thoughts rather than plotted transitions. It feels almost literary, as if paragraphs of mood were being written on celluloid. The budget, roughly $40 million, was modest by Hollywood standards but enormous relative to its tone. Coppola spent most of it on time, longer shooting days, multiple takes, and weather patience, rather than spectacle. He famously refused to use second units. "If my name's on it," he said, "my eyes must see it." In an era obsessed with efficiency, that was practically rebellious. Yet that rebellion preserved soul. When you watch the film, nothing feels delegated. Every frame carries the signature of one man reconciling with his craft. Ironically, that devotion produced one of his quickest, least troubled shoots. The crew wrapped ahead of schedule, a rarity for Coppola. It's almost as if humility rewarded him with order. Among the quieter joys of production was the local community's involvement. Residents loaned vintage cars, furniture, even family photographs to decorate sets. Churches opened doors for shelter during rain delays. Children gathered near barriers just to watch Damon practice speeches between takes. One elderly woman, who had lost her husband to an insurance denial years earlier, reportedly told Coppola that she felt heard merely by seeing lights on her street. He later sent her flowers with a note for helping us tell the truth. Such gestures explain why the film feels communal, made with Memphis, not just in it. Sound design carried equal intention. Instead of crisp Hollywood clarity, Coppola asked for imperfection. Background hums, thunder rumbles, distant trains. He told engineers that justice should sound slightly drowned. The resulting soundscape blurs dialogue into weather, creating an auditory metaphor for moral noise. Even silence has texture. During the courtroom finale, if you listen closely, rain beats faintly against windows, syncing with Rudy's heartbeat. That wasn't added later. Microphones actually captured the storm outside. Post-production mixers preserved it after realizing how perfectly it mirrored the scene's tension. Sometimes nature does the composing for you. There are stories of on-set improvisations that reveal the director's trust in spontaneity. In one scene where Rudy comforts a black family, Damon accidentally knocked over a glass of water and instinctively apologized. The actor stayed in character, and the apology became part of the dialogue. Coppola kept it, calling it a small baptism. Another moment occurred when DeVito ad-libbed a line about law being the last circus where clowns can still be noble. The crew laughed, but Coppola insisted it stay. It summarized the film better than any script note. Those accidents, tiny and human, give the movie its heartbeat. They remind me that perfection often hides in mistakes we're wise enough not to fix. The post-production period brought its own quiet drama. Test screenings worried executives because audiences expecting a thriller found something contemplative instead. Studio marketing struggled. Was it legal drama, a romance, or a character study? Coppola refused to simplify. He told them, it's about people who still believe in fairness. Call that whatever you like. The compromise was a trailer emphasizing suspense, though the film itself moved like prayer. It underperformed commercially but earned steady admiration. Years later, when critics revisited Coppola's filmography, many declared this one his most emotionally coherent work since Apocalypse Now. Time, it seems, became its best publicist. Music recording sessions added another layer of warmth. Composer Elmer Bernstein conducted a small orchestra rather than a full symphonic ensemble. Coppola sat in the dark, eyes closed, listening as the first cues played. When the final note faded, he whispered, "That's what conscience sounds like." Bernstein laughed but understood. The score that followed feels almost invisible, not accompaniment but empathy. Its restraint mirrors a director's late career philosophy, emotion through subtraction. Even the final cue, built on 4 repeating piano notes, was performed live to picture rather than timed digitally, giving it a human irregularity. You can sense the pulse of fingers, not software. What fascinates me most about the production, literature-loving friends, is how every technical decision seems guided by moral instinct rather than aesthetics. Lighting becomes ethics, casting becomes faith, editing becomes forgiveness. The film's making was less industrial than spiritual, a group of people rediscovering sincerity inside a cynical medium. Crew members often describe the experience as therapy disguised as work. Damon said later that after finishing, he understood for the first time that cinema could heal rather than merely impress. That, to me, is the ultimate fun fact. Not a piece of trivia, but a truth about art's hidden medicine. Even stranger coincidences linger. The day Coppola wrapped principal photography, real rain flooded the courthouse steps they had used for weeks. As the crew packed, he looked up at the storm and said softly, "It's finishing its own movie." Decades later, he recalled that moment as proof that the universe sometimes collaborates when sincerity leads. And maybe that's why this production feels blessed in retrospect. Everyone involved seems to remember not chaos or ego, but calm. the man who once orchestrated cinematic wars, found peace directing a whisper. Out of all his masterpieces, this one might have been his prayer. When I watch it now, knowing these stories, I feel gratitude, not just for what appears on screen, but for how gently it was made. It stands as evidence that creation doesn't always require madness. Sometimes it requires mercy. Every drizzle on lens, every trembling line of dialogue, every imperfect take preserved in Final Cut carries the echo of that mercy. Behind the credits, behind the craft, lies a simple fact that's somehow the strangest of all. And try to tell a story about decency, everyone involved became a little more decent themselves. There's a special kind of sadness that lives inside southern towns after the rain, a damp quiet that turns every street into a memory. The setting of this film is built on that silence. Memphis becomes less a backdrop and more a state of being, a place where morality, weather, and architecture seem to conspire to tell the same story. Every frame is soaked with humidity, not just of climate, but of conscience. I've always believed that great directors don't simply choose locations, they converse with them. Here, the conversation between Francis Ford Coppola and the city feels deeply personal, like two tired souls recognizing each other's weariness. The geography itself mirrors the human condition the story describes, beautiful, decayed, and still stubbornly alive. The cityscape carries the weight of America's forgotten promises. You can see it in the crumbling red brick buildings, in the flicker of neon signs half-lit over diners, in the rusted ironwork of old bridges that seem to remember better times. These are not postcard images. They're the bones of a civilization built on idealism and left to erode under capitalism's indifference. The streets glisten after rainfall, not like mirrors but like wounds healing underwater. Even the courthouse, that great cathedral of supposed fairness, looks tired, with paint fading and marble cracked. Coppola and cinematographer John Toll turn these details into moral poetry. The buildings lean inward, as if eavesdropping on human failure. The geography itself testifies. Inside these settings, light becomes confession. Toll shot most interiors with what he called moral daylight, a diffused brightness that exposes without glorifying. There's something almost biblical about it, illumination that reveals flaws rather than erases them. Courtrooms, offices, and apartments are bathed in a sickly yellow tone that feels like faded optimism. The visual texture is closer to parchment than film, as if we're reading a story that's been handled by too many hands. The rain, meanwhile, acts as cinematographer's co-author. It refracts the light, softens edges, and sometimes turns entire scenes into liquid impressionism. You can sense how patient the camera is, how it waits for clouds to move into perfect melancholy. Few films understand weather as emotion the way this one does. The cinematography's rhythm matches the city's pulse, unhurried, observant, melancholic. The camera rarely intrudes. It listens. When characters speak, it lingers a fraction longer after dialogue ends, capturing the space where truth hesitates. That extra second of silence is where humanity hides. In those moments, I often feel the film teaching us how to look again, how to let ordinary rooms breathe. There are no stylized crane shots or dramatic angles shouting for attention. The lens stays at human height, inviting empathy rather than awe. In that humility lies the film's grandeur. It feels almost literary in structure. Scenes unfold like paragraphs, connected by rhythm instead of spectacle. Color, too, tells its own moral story. The palette shifts subtly from warm tones in early scenes, where Rudy still believes in ideals, to cooler grays as reality sets in. By the courtroom sequences, everything seems drained of saturation, as if ethics itself were fading from the world. And yet, within those desaturated frames, small pockets of color survive. The red of a coffee mug, the green of courthouse folders, the faint blue of Kelly's dress. These are visual metaphors for hope, fragile but persistent. Coppola uses color the way novelists use subtext. Quiet, intentional, invisible until you feel it. The final scenes, bathed in soft evening light, return to muted warmth, suggesting that while the world remains flawed, compassion still glows somewhere in its cracks. Sound design in the setting is another miracle of restraint. You can hear the environment breathing. Ceiling fans hum like anxious thoughts. Distant thunder murmurs like suppressed guilt. Cars splash through puddles with weary rhythm. creating a natural percussion of melancholy. Even dialogue seems to echo slightly, as if the city itself is repeating every word in disbelief. One of the most beautiful touches is how Coppola lets rain substitute for music in several scenes. Instead of orchestration, you hear drizzle tapping against windows, blending with quiet conversations. It's not ambience, it's conscience externalized. The film becomes an auditory poem where guilt, grief, and grace sound like rainfall on old tin roofs. The apartments and offices we visit feel almost sentient. Rudy's shabby room, with its flickering lamp and stacks of unpaid bills, looks like it's been absorbing other people's despair for decades. The law office he shares with Deck feels improvised, half refuge, half trap. The cramped corridors, low ceilings, and brown wood paneling visually compress the characters, making morality itself feel claustrophobic. Even Kelly's home, a supposed domestic space, radiates threat through its dim corners and stale air. These settings don't just contain characters, they define them. Coppola's genius lies in allowing architecture to participate in storytelling. Every door creak sounds like judgment. Every corridor feels like a moral hallway leading nowhere. When we move to the courtroom, the film's symbolic heart, the space transforms into theater. The room is symmetrical, solemn, lit by shafts of light that slice through dust particles like divine inspection. Yet it's too small for grandeur. It feels cramped, as if justice has outgrown its architecture. That visual irony is deliberate. The scale of human suffering exceeds the size of human institutions. The way the camera frames Rudy against towering stacks of files or empty spectator benches amplifies that imbalance. It's not a courtroom of heroes and villains, but of human fatigue. The judges, clerks, and jurors appear worn, their faces carrying years of moral compromise. Even the wooden furniture seems exhausted from holding so many half-truths. Watching it, I often feel that the building itself is on trial. The use of mirrors and reflections throughout fascinates me. There are scenes where characters stand beside rain-streaked glass, their faces doubled, blurred by water. It's a recurring motif, the idea that integrity and illusion are constantly overlapping. The rain becomes a moral filter through which truth passes distorted. One shot, in particular, stays in my mind. Rudy looking out a window while thunder murmurs behind him. The glass trembles slightly, turning his reflection into something ghost-like. It's as though the city is showing him his future, idealism dissolving into survival instinct. Few directors choreograph reflection as emotion so elegantly. Coppola does it here with painterly precision. Then there's the music, or rather, the film's careful avoidance of it. Elmer Bernstein's score appears sparingly, like memory rather than accompaniment. His melodies drift in softly, build on slow piano and subdued strings. The sound feels less composed and remembered, like hymns fading in and out of consciousness. What's remarkable is how silence becomes a dominant instrument. Coppola uses absence of music the way others use crescendo, to make us aware of emotional gravity without manipulation. When the score finally returns during the verdict, it doesn't celebrate victory. It mourns what had to die for truth to survive. The harmony feels fragile, almost ashamed of itself, and then fades into rain again. The pacing of the visuals, their editing and motion, embodies the ethical rhythm of the story. Shots linger longer than comfort allows, as if Coppola wanted viewers to wrestle with images instead of consuming them. When a scene ends, it doesn't cut, it exhales. That breathing quality gives a film its emotional intelligence. We aren't pushed, we're invited. Every transition feels like the turning of a page rather than the click of a reel. There's something almost novelistic about the pacing, meditative, deliberate, quietly suspenseful. It trusts us to feel the passage of time as the characters do. Slow, uncertain, heavy with waiting. If the visual world could speak, it would whisper themes of corrosion and resilience. The recurring imagery of water and decay turns setting into philosophy. Rain falls on mansions and shacks alike, suggesting moral equality. Everyone is drenched, yet drainage patterns reveal inequality. Puddles collect in poorer neighborhoods, symbolizing how suffering gathers in predictable places. Even light obeys class hierarchy. It's harsh and fluorescent in corporate offices, but soft and natural in the homes of the powerless. Coppola doesn't need dialogue to make these points. The mise-en-scene speaks fluently. Watching it, I'm reminded of Southern Gothic literature, where the landscape is a moral mirror, beauty rotting into beauty's opposite. The symbolic role of Memphis blues culture also hums beneath the surface. Though no soundtrack explicitly invokes it, the pacing, tone, and melancholy borrow from the blues tradition. The city's legacy of struggle and rhythm seeps into how characters move and speak. You can almost hear ghostly notes between conversations. Even the sound of thunder feels syncopated, like nature keeping time with human pain. Coppola once described a movie as a blues song about fairness, and that feels exact. The city itself plays the lead guitar, sliding between despair and dignity with aching grace. One of the most haunting visual motifs is doors. They open and close throughout. Courtroom doors, apartment doors, office doors, hospital doors, and each movement seems to measure moral passage. The camera often lingers on thresholds just after characters leave, emphasizing emptiness over presence. It's as if the film keeps asking, what remains when decency walks out? That recurring emptiness builds quiet tension. Even endings feel provisional, as though the world keeps turning indifferent to virtue. The final image of rain falling on empty streets completes this thought. Justice has been done, yet nothing really changes. The setting continues to breathe its weary beauty, untouched by verdicts. Every element, lighting, architecture, sound, weather, converges into one immersive emotion, empathy. The city doesn't judge its inhabitants. It weeps with them. That compassion radiates through the screen, dissolving the barrier between viewer and setting. We don't just watch Memphis, we inhabit it. We feel the sticky air, the moral fog, the tired kindness of strangers. The cinematic design becomes experiential literature, where space holds meaning like language. You can almost imagine Faulkner, Tennessee Williams, and John Grisham sitting together somewhere in the afterlife, smiling at how cinema borrowed their ghosts and gave them motion. And when the final rain falls, washing over rooftops and sidewalks, it feels like the city itself exhaling. Tired of corruption, yet unwilling to lose faith in humanity. That's the paradox at the heart of this setting. Despair and hope existing in the same wet air. Coppola's camera doesn't capture scenery. It captures moral weather. It reminds us that the world, like us, is trying to stay honest under impossible conditions. And when the credits roll, that quiet rain keeps falling in our minds, blurring lines between fiction and the real streets we step into, a cinematic aftertaste of empathy that refuses to dry. What happens behind the camera often tells a quieter, stranger story than the one playing on the screen, and this film's making feels almost like a novel about perseverance disguised as production diary. Everyone involved seems to have been fighting their own small trial. Francis Ford Coppola wrestling with memory, Matt Damon with self-doubt, Danny DeVito with faith and decency, the crew with endless Memphis rain that refused to obey call sheets. The irony, of course, is that a movie about endurance ended up demanding it from everyone who made it. When you peel back the layers of its production, what you find is less a Hollywood machine and more a community workshop, where sincerity became both the tool and the reward. Coppola began the project in a fragile season of his life. The grandeur that had once crowned him, the vineyards, the studios, the impossible projects, had turned heavy. He had mortgaged his home more than once to finance passion films that critics misunderstood, and now he wanted something simpler, almost penitent. Crew members recall him saying on the first day of shooting, "Let's make something honest enough to pay our debts to art." That line set the tone. There were no entourages, no megaphones, just a director who walked with a notebook instead of a storyboard. He called it his silent decade, a phase where he preferred whispers to declarations. The cast later said they never saw him raise his voice. Not once, a rarity for a man whose earlier sets were symphonies of chaos. Matt Damon arrived like a student entering a masterclass he wasn't sure he'd been admitted to. Fresh from writing a small script with his friend Ben Affleck that no one had yet filmed, he carried the unspoken fear of being miscast. He looked too young for gravitas, too gentle for courtroom bravado. Coppola sensed that insecurity and turned it into method. He told him, "Play Rudy as yourself on your worst self-doubting day." Damon later said that note freed him. He stopped acting confident and started acting truthful. During breaks, Coppola would quietly film Damon pacing, thinking, rubbing his eyes. Some of those inserts found their way into transitional montages. What might have been nerves became authenticity. Behind the scenes, Damon wrote daily reflections in a small black notebook, which he later gave to Coppola as a thank you. The director kept it on his editing desk, calling it the diary of a conscience. Danny DeVito was the opposite energy, irrepressible, comic, loud with love. Between takes, he told jokes so relentlessly that sound engineers often ruin recordings by laughing. Yet behind that humor was deep admiration. DeVito had produced Pulp Fiction a few years earlier and had tasted the volatility of independent cinema. He understood Coppola's exhaustion. On set, he often acted as emotional bridge, the one who'd nudge younger crew members, saying, "Relax, we're in good hands." Coppola adored him for that steadiness. There's a lovely anecdote. One rainy afternoon, a crane broke down mid-shoot. While technicians panicked, DeVito organized a spontaneous picnic under umbrellas for the whole crew, serving sandwiches from his own trailer. Coppola joined them, laughing, and later wrote in his production journal, "Dex saved the day again, this time off camera." That fellowship seeps through the film. You can feel it in every scene where Rudy and Dex share cramped space but endless loyalty. Claire Danes, barely out of adolescence, entered the set as a quiet presence. Coppola treated her with almost paternal tenderness, forbidding anyone from rushing her. When she struggled with emotionally heavy scenes depicting abuse, he would close the set dim lights and play soft piano music through hidden speakers to create safety. He told her, "We'll carry the pain for you." She once said that those words taught her more about directing than any film school could. Her tears on screen were not the product of manipulation, but of trust. The crew called her the Eye of Calm, because whenever she appeared, even the weather seemed to soften. That invisible care shows in the movie's tone. There's no exploitation of her trauma, only empathy captured through patience. The Memphis community's involvement became its own legend. Local residents volunteered as extras, donated props, and even offered home-cooked meals when rain delays stretched late into night. One church opened its basement as impromptu storage for camera equipment during storms. The pastor refused payment, saying, "If the movie is about justice, the least we can do is shelter it." That humility moved everyone. Coppola later sent the congregation a sign print with the inscription, "To those who kept the rain holy." The collaboration blurred lines between art and life. Crew members spoke of feeling part of a moral mission rather than a job. When the Black's house scenes were shot in a real working-class neighborhood, local families stood outside, quietly watching, some wiping tears during takes. After filming ended, the production left behind repaired fences and newly painted porches as thank yous. The city still remembers. Technically, the shoot was full of improvisation. The constant weather changes forced new schedules daily. Coppola adopted what he called storm logic, filming interiors whenever rain turned violent, then dashing outdoors between showers. Continuity became chaos, but somehow it added realism. Puddles grew from scene to scene, as if nature were keeping emotional score. The cinematographer John told joked that Memphis was the film's second AD. One evening, lightning hit a transformer near set, plunging everything into darkness. Instead of stopping, Coppola lit the room with flashlights and candles, turning the accident into atmosphere. The resulting footage, tinted golden by emergency light, later became one of the film's most haunting images. Rudy working late alone, face half-shadowed, surrounded by papers. Art born from inconvenience. That was the production's rhythm. There were creative experiments, too. Coppola revived an old trick from his Apocalypse nowadays, rolling multiple cameras at slightly different frame rates to capture variations of emotion. He'd ask actors to repeat lines at whisper, mid-tone, and full voice, then weave the takes together in editing like musical chords. He compared it to jazz improvisation. The same theme played 3 emotional octaves apart. That's why dialogue feels oddly rhythmic, almost sung in places. Editors later discovered tiny sync mismatches where lips move fractionally ahead of sound, creating a subconscious tension that mirrors legal unease. Coppola decided not to fix them, calling those flaws truth vibrations. One of the most moving behind-the-scenes stories involves an elderly woman named Martha, who worked as a background extra during courthouse scenes. She had lost her son to a denied insurance claim years earlier, eerily similar to the film's plot. On the final day of her shoot, she approached Coppola with trembling hands and said, "Thank you for telling our story. It hurts, but it's healing." Coppola hugged her, tears visible, and later told the cast that Martha had reminded him why he still made films. He dedicated the day's work to her. You can almost feel her presence in the final cut, a ghostly witness sitting among jurors, watching history replay itself with compassion. Even the animals on set added accidental poetry. A stray dog began appearing every morning outside the courthouse location, waiting silently through hours of filming. Crew members nicknamed him Justice. They fed him leftovers and let him roam free around equipment. When production wrapped, DeVito adopted him and flew him to Los Angeles. That small act became crew folklore. That Justice went home with Deck, both on and off screen. Years later, DeVito mentioned in an interview that the dog lived 12 happy years and never stopped sleeping beside his desk during script readings. Sometimes symbolism doesn't need planning. It walks into your shot wagging its tail. Post-production carried its own peculiar grace. Coppola edited alone in Napa, projecting dailies onto a white wall instead of professional screen. He wanted imperfection. He wanted to feel like he was reading a manuscript, not finishing a product. Friends who visited him recall long evenings of wine, music, and silence broken only by the clatter of film reels. He would watch certain scenes over and over, sometimes whispering lines aloud like prayers. One visitor asked why he looked so sad during the final verdict sequence. He answered, "Because I know how rare real justice is." That melancholy saturates the finished movie. You can sense the editor mourning what the story implies. When award season arrived, the film didn't roar, it whispered. Critics praised performances, but called it too quiet for voters. Coppola shrugged. He said, perhaps it was never meant for applause. Perhaps it was meant for reflection. Yet behind the scenes, the film found its strange legacy. Law professors requested prints for classroom ethics discussions. Medical boards screened it to illustrate insurance dilemmas. Even corporate trainers used clips about moral decision-making. The movie that so modestly became a secret textbook in empathy, that unheralded influence delighted Coppola more than trophies. He once said, "If a film helps someone choose kindness in a meeting, that's better than an Oscar." Among the lighter memories, crew stories abound. Damon learning to juggle files between takes became a running joke. DeVito held contests for who could pronounce subrogation fastest. Coppola cooked pasta for everyone on Sundays, insisting good food kept morale honest. There's a snapshot from those dinners. Damon and Danes laughing over spilled wine. Coppola mid-story, rain streaking window glass behind them. You can sense the rare harmony that sometimes blesses film sets. Hierarchy dissolving into humanity. That shared warmth survived the decades. Whenever cast reunite at festivals, they speak less of cinematography and more of those suppers, that weather, that feeling of belonging to something modest but meaningful. Perhaps the most revealing behind-the-scenes truth is that the making mirrored the message. Everyone arrived carrying personal fatigue, financial, emotional, artistic, and left lighter. The process itself became a moral cleansing. Coppola found peace in humility. Damon found validation through vulnerability. Danes discovered emotional boundaries. DeVito rediscovered joy in simplicity. Even the crew, many of whom had bounced between blockbusters, said afterward that this project reminded them why they entered filmmaking, not for fame, but for shared storytelling. There's something sacred about a set where exhaustion turns into gratitude. In interviews years later, Coppola described the experience as a small prayer answered by rain. He said he'd made larger, louder, richer films, but this one felt most honest. That honesty was born behind the camera. In every unplanned storm, every broken light replaced with candle glow, every lunch shared with strangers turned friends. The production never chased perfection. It chased truth, and in that pursuit, it became quietly revolutionary. Sometimes cinema doesn't need miracles of technology. It needs ordinary decency practiced over and over until it becomes art. When I think of this film now, I imagine not the courtroom but the set itself, muddy boots by trailer doors, coffee steam mixing with drizzle, Coppola smiling beneath his hooded coat as lightning briefly lights the sky. That image feels truer than any publicity still. It's a portrait of creation stripped of ego, where storytelling returns to its oldest form. People huddle together in bad weather, try and make sense of right and wrong. Behind those cameras, a family formed, and through their work, they build a small shelter of sincerity against the storm. That, my literature-loving friends, is a real masterpiece. Not the film that ended up on screen, but the grace that happened just out of frame. Every work of art that endures does so because it discovers something timeless hidden inside the temporary. And this story, for all its courtroom decorum, is really a meditation on the weather of human morality, how easily truth floods and how hard it is to dry. Beneath its legal arguments and southern humidity runs a moral river connecting themes that feel almost biblical in their simplicity: justice, conscience, decay, redemption, and the strange holiness of compassion. Watching it, I always feel I'm reading an old parable disguised as modern litigation, one where water stands in for grace and paperwork for sin. Each theme emerges not as lecture but as atmosphere, drifting in through rain-streaked windows and whispered confessions. It's the kind of movie that doesn't tell you what it's about. It makes you feel what it's about until you can no longer separate story from self. At its core lies the eternal struggle between the individual conscience and institutional indifference. The courtroom, with its mahogany formality and fluorescent indifference, becomes a temple to bureaucracy, sacred in theory, corrupt in practice. Against it stands one idealist armed only with decency. It's David versus Goliath retold for the age of insurance claims. But what fascinates me is how the film refuses to grant David miraculous strength. His weapon is sincerity, and sincerity is not cinematic. It's quiet, clumsy, and unmarketable. Yet the film treats it as a revolutionary force. In a world that mistakes cynicism for intelligence, mere honesty becomes subversive. That's why Rudy's small victories feel immense. Every honest line he speaks sounds like thunder cracking across polite corruption. The story whispers a radical idea, that in modern systems, goodness itself is an act of rebellion. Justice, here, is less a verdict than a condition of the soul. The legal victory rings hollow because it exposes a deeper defeat. The realization that even when truth wins, cruelty can still declare bankruptcy and walk away untouched. The narrative refuses to comfort the illusion that right will conquer wrong. Instead, it suggests that integrity survives by endurance, not triumph. That moral realism is what makes the film literary. It belongs to the lineage of stories where justice is measured not by outcome, but by effort. The same lineage as Les Miserables, The Trial, or To Kill a Mockingbird. In those works, and here, redemption lies in trying. The protagonist doesn't cleanse the system. He refuses to be dirted by it. That subtle inversion transforms a genre thriller into a quiet sermon on moral persistence. Rain, the film's omnipresent symbol, carries the story's spiritual vocabulary. It falls incessantly on victories, defeats, funerals, and first meetings, refusing to discriminate between sinner and saint. It becomes the impartial hand of fate, washing, erasing, and renewing. In literature, water has always meant transformation. The flood of Genesis, the baptism of Christ, the tears of penance. Here, it performs all those roles at once. It exposes corruption by soaking it. It baptizes idealism by drenching it. And finally, it leaves everyone shivering, stripped of illusion. The constant downpour is both cleansing and cruel, a reminder that purity demands discomfort. When Rudy walks through the rain in the final scenes, it isn't pathetic fallacy. It's sacrament. The world has not changed, but even washed in naivety without losing faith. That's grace in its most adult form. Corruption, too, is portrayed not as villainy but as habit. The corporations and their lawyers don't twirl mustaches or gloat. They simply follow procedure. That's what makes them terrifying. Evil here is administrative. It lives in memos, denial letters, and polite smiles. The story thus becomes a parable about modern morality, how sin survives not through malice but through normalization. The executives deny claims because that's policy. The lawyers defend cruelty because that's duty. Everyone's language has been sanitized of guilt. It's Hannah Arendt's banality of evil, rendered in legal English. Against such machinery, emotion itself becomes revolutionary. Every time a character cries, hesitates, or apologizes, is an act of resistance. The human voice is the only protest left in a world governed by fine print. The film's treatment of class deepens this theme. Memphis is depicted as a city stratified by rainwater. Those on higher ground stay dry. Those in the floodplain drown. The poor characters live literally beneath the dripping roofs of moral neglect. Their kitchens leak, their courts leak, their hope leaks. The wealthy inhabit climate-controlled offices where even weather is outsourced by making the setting porous. Coppola turns class inequality into climate. Everyone breathes it, but only some can afford umbrellas. The story never preaches about economics, yet every shot of the black's modest home next to the corporate skyscraper speaks louder than speeches. Justice, we realize, has always been topographically biased. Alongside systemic injustice runs a subtler theme of personal redemption. Each major character carries private guilt. Rudy fears becoming the kind of lawyer who hides morality behind law. Kelly struggles to forgive herself for surviving abuse. Deck masks disappointment with cynicism. Even Drummond, the corporate antagonist, radiates buried regret. The courtroom becomes collective confession, where everyone, knowingly or not, testifies to their own compromises. What redeems them isn't victory, but vulnerability. In allowing themselves to feel again, to hurt, to hope, to admit fear, they reclaim something sacred that institutions cannot patent: empathy. That emotional resurrection, quiet and unspectacular, feels like the film's real miracle. Another recurring motif is paperwork, treated almost as metaphysical object. The endless forms, contract, and letters of modern scripture. Texts written not by prophets but by bureaucrats, shaping lives with divine indifference. The irony is exquisite. Salvation and damnation now come in triplicate. By focusing on documents instead of guns or politics, the story reframes evil as clerical. It's a brilliant metaphor for our age, where decisions that crush families are typed in air-conditioned offices far from consequence. Each page of paper becomes a ghost, representing unseen suffering. In that sense, the film predicts our digital present, where empathy risks extinction through automation. It's not just about an insurance company. It's about a civilization outsourcing its conscience. Love, fragile and necessary, threads through these heavier ideas like a candle through fog. The bond between Rudy and Kelly is less romance than refuge. They don't fall in love. They lean into survival. Their tenderness grows in small, trembling gestures, a shared coffee, a protective glance, a silence that feels safe. In their connection lies the film's subtlest message. That personal kindness remains a last institution, uncorrupted by profit. When everything else collapses, law, business, government, two people choosing gentleness can still uphold the world a little longer. That belief, naive yet essential, echoes through Coppola's filmography, from the violent families of The Godfather to this modest pair standing in rainlight. Where power fails, empathy endures. Faith and doubt also shape the film's emotional architecture. Rudy believes in justice the way a lapsed believer still looks at stained glass, suspicious but hopeful. The rain, the church's glimpse in the distance, the funerals, all remind us that morality and spirituality share soil. There's even a subtle resurrection motif. Donnie Ray's death sparks a collective awakening. His unseen suffering resurrects integrity in those left behind. Like so many literary martyrs, he saves others by dying anonymously. The courtroom verdict, hollow though it may be, becomes his memorial service. The cross he never cared appears symbolically in the balanced scale of law. Justice reimagined as crucifix. Gender and power form another symbolic layer through Kelly's narrative. Her abusive marriage reflects the same hierarchies present in the legal world. Male control disguised as protection. By defending herself, she enacts the justice the system could not provide. Her act of survival mirrors Rudy's legal defiance. Both challenge patriarchal structures that use civility to disguise violence. Yet the film avoids turning her into a symbol of vengeance. She remains human, fragile, capable of kindness after catastrophe. That complexity transforms a feminist subtext into universal truth. Liberation requires not rage alone, but reclamation of dignity. Even humor has symbolic weight. Deck's wisecracks, though comic relief, function like scripture's parables, jokes carrying moral logic. His humor is survival theology. He laughs not because things are funny, but because despair would be too accurate. The story treats laughter as resistance, a small rebellion against institutional solemnity. In that sense, comedy becomes conscience's armor. Every grin is a refusal to surrender to apathy. Coppola embeds moral symbolism in his craft as well. The camera's stillness mirrors ethical restraint. The long takes echo patience. The rain-softened light resembles mercy. Even editing carries meaning. Transitions dissolve rather than cut, suggesting that moral boundaries blur, that guilt and goodness coexist. The color grading, fading from gold to gray to muted blue, visually tracks the soul's erosion and faint renewal. The filmmaking itself becomes an ethical language, where aesthetics are not decoration but doctrine. It's remarkable how seamlessly the director turns technique into theology. There's also the recurring image of doors and windows, barriers between choice and consequence. They open slightly, then close too late. Every character seems caught in a frame within a frame, emphasizing confinement. Yet by the final act, when Rudy leaves the profession, the door opens to real air. That simple gesture, stepping outside into rain, carries the weight of existential liberation. It's as if he's walking out of Plato's cave, blinking into moral daylight, soaked but awake. Few cinematic metaphors achieve such quiet eloquence. On a broader level, the story engages with the American myth itself. The dream that hard work ensures fairness collapses under the weight of fine print. It's the post-industrial elegy for decency, capitalism's courtroom confession. The film mourns a country where success has replaced virtue as moral currency, yet it refuses bitterness. Instead, it offers small redemption. The belief that individuals, though powerless to reform systems, can still choose to remain kind. That modest hope turns tragedy into him. It's an old American melody, weary, weathered, but still humming. The final symbolism rests in departure. When the protagonist quits law, he performs a secular exodus, leaving Egypt's bureaucracy for the desert of conscience. The rain outside becomes his Red Sea, turbulent but passable. The promised land is not prosperity, but peace of mind. That ending transforms the entire narrative into spiritual allegory. It says that salvation lies not in fixing the world, but in refusing to be corrupted by it. For a country, and perhaps a species, addicted to progress, that's radical wisdom. To step away can be the holiest form of engagement. Every symbol, every theme, circles back to the same center: compassion as resistance. The film's moral universe insists that empathy is not weakness but strategy. Bureaucracy dehumanizes. Compassion rehumanizes. That's the eternal struggle playing out in every generation, from Dickens to Grisham, from pulpits to courtrooms. And in showing that struggle without grandiosity, this film achieves something most political works fail to: humility. It doesn't shout its ideals. It simply lives them. The rain keeps falling, and people keep choosing, one act at a time, whether to shelter others or themselves. When the screen finally fades to gray and that quiet piano fade with it, I'm left thinking not about lawyers or verdicts, but about water. How it falls, how it finds cracks, how it never stops trying to cleanse even what resists cleansing. That's the film's ultimate metaphor for goodness. Persistent, patient, unstoppable in its humility. My literature-loving friends, every time I revisit it, I'm reminded that integrity, like rain, may be inconvenient, may soak and chill, but it nourishes what would otherwise die of dryness. And perhaps that's the only justice art can promise us. Not that it will fix the world, but that it will keep it from drying out entirely. When you strip away the story, the performances, and even the rain, what remains here is a kind of cinematic architecture built on restraint, a film that succeeds not through invention, but through sincerity of craft. In an age of flashy editing and loud moralizing, Francis Ford Coppola made something almost archaic in his quiet craftsmanship. Every technical choice feels like a moral decision. The movie operates less like a spectacle and more like a moral essay written in camera language. And perhaps that's what makes it so haunting. The craft doesn't just serve the story. It is a story,